In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Tiber Martyrs,
Pray for us.
St. Thomas Aquinas,
Pray for us.
Christus Resurrexi, Alleluia.
Sicut Dixis, Alleluia.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. So we're going over chapter 4 of the Flippin' Packet. And chapter 4 is focusing on the internal senses. And how many internal senses are there?
4.
There are 4. And so we are on chapter 4. Wasn't that nice? Let's do some review. Does anyone remember the names of the 4 internal senses? The names of any of them? Let's try to get at least 2 or 3.
Common sense? The common sense?
The common sense is 1. Very good. What's another one? Can anyone remember this one? No one can remember any others?
Is one of them our memory?
Memory is another one. Yes, very good. All right, so we got the common sense. We got the memory. All right, so just try to think of another one. Like in your wildest imagination, what could possibly be another internal sense power?
Imagination.
All right, those are some very good cognitive thinking skills, which brings us to the 4th, the cognitive power. Okay. So we're going to go through each one of these in detail, and we're going to read some excerpts from St. Thomas as we go through it. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the common sense. Now, in other places, the common sense can also be called the unitive sense or the central sense. And what is the main function of the common sense that you've learned so far, between the last 2 semesters?
Reasoning?
It does no. Reasoning will belong to something else. No. Although we typically will say that about people, like if someone lacks basic reasoning, they say, they have no common sense, right? But that is an alteration of the term from its original origin. Think of like the different names up there. The unitive sense. Unity, bringing things together.
Motor functions? Like, I don't even know how to describe them. Like, making things work together.
Making things work together. Yeah, it makes things work together. In particular, what it makes work together is your 5 external senses. Okay, so it's one thing to see something, it's another thing to hear something, to hear sound. Your common sense is like, oh, this sound and what I'm seeing goes together, they're the same thing. All right? Because if you think about it, your eyes left on their own don't hear, so the eye of itself is not going to make the judgment that the mouse is what's squeaking. Right? Your ear on its own hears, but it doesn't see things. So your power of hearing isn't going to be what determines, oh, this squeaking goes together with the little gray thing running across the floor that I'm seeing, that we call a mouse, right? And so there's another power where the 5 senses are pooled together, and it kind of unites what's being brought in into one image, right? And it gives unity to it. So first and foremost, it grasps the objects of the 5 exterior senses. All right, it pools them all together. Now, because it has that ability to pool all these, those differences of like touch, smell, sight, what have you, it is also what enables us to perceive what is common and proper to each sense. So that all that jargon up there sounds kind of confusing, but basically, the way I can understand it or try to explain to you guys is your common sense is what enables you to be aware of the fact that you are perceiving color by means of sight as opposed to hearing colors. Okay? It's what allows you to make distinctions between like, oh, what's common is I can see shape, I can also feel shape. And so your common sense is what enables you to like, oh, shape can be apprehended by multiple ways. And what is proper? It's like, oh, I can only see color. I'm never going to like feel what orange feels like. Okay, your common sense gives you that basic level of awareness about reality. All right, next, it makes us aware of being alive or awake. And this might be where more of our colloquial use of common sense comes from, where if you're someone who's asleep, you're not particularly rational. Okay, and so if someone lacks common sense, it's like they're in a sleep state, so to speak. But like you're present, and the power of you to be able to distinguish images you see when you're asleep and images that you're seeing when you're awake. All right, they're both present in your imagination, but it's your common sense that knows how to make that distinction. The common sense also immediately perceives pleasure and pain. All right, it's one thing to taste food that tastes good, okay, but then the common sense is like, ding ding, this is a pleasurable sensation. Let's keep going after it. And then, lastly, and most importantly for philosophy, is the common sense produces phantasms. It produces phantasms. So while you're, you receive your senses, like there's the tree outside, you can go lick it, you can go touch it, you can see it, whatever. You get all this sense data about the tree, and then when you walk away from the tree, you can still recall that image of the tree, right? And that image that's able to be recalled, it's not the power of common sense at work. That's a different power. But the fact that that image exists is a result of your common sense, right? It took everything you just sensed and created an image of that thing, okay? Phantasms are very, very important in Thomistic psychology, right? Understanding like mental health in humans and such. And also they're practical for understanding human relations. So like if you know someone, right, as long as you're not actively engaging with that person, what are you thinking? Like when you think about that person when they're not present, what you're engaging with is a phantasm in your mind, okay? Now, there's a problem that a lot of people are facing today because of developments in technology where relationships try to get like formed, but there's communication that takes place electronically. And what you're missing is you're missing an informed phantasm, is what I like to call it. So, for example, when you're talking with someone, you get a lot of like body language cues There's interaction back and forth. We are corporeal creatures, right? So we're made to communicate in like this bodily way, right? Especially the Italians, right? They're always like flinging their hands everywhere and gesticulating. But when your communication is boiled down to, like, say, text messaging, you don't really talk to someone too often unless it's over text because you're shy or whatever, or you're like messaging people on social media platforms. What happens is that typically communication is one of the things that leads, okay? But in a natural order, those actions would also be informed by your external senses. But now in like social media platforms, they're no longer informed by your external senses, except for like a picture that person chose to put up of themselves, okay? And that's what you're interacting with. And so when you don't get the body language cues, you don't get the inflection of voice, like all the things that sight and hearing are very important in forming relationships, you can end up with completely erroneous phantasms of that person. And one of two things can happen. You can either idealize the phantasm, right? So because of your limited interaction, your idea of that person is kind of set on this pedestal, and it can create a kind of awkward scenario where if you actually go and talk to that person, but you communicate most of the time via electronically, then like that encounter is like you don't know how to talk to each other because your phantasm then isn't matching up, and then their phantasm of you doesn't also match up. And it's kind of like you're talking to a stranger and meeting someone for the first time. But there's this added extra awkward element of like a lot of knowledge that is communicated through words, which is more intellectual. Okay. And then just one more point before I move on about phantasms that I wanted to make, but I'm struggling to remember. The other thing that can happen is instead of idealizing the phantasm, if it's a person you don't particularly like, or you just kind of miscue things, it can be like the opposite of idealizing. You just make not be a terrible person or whatever. So like maybe you've got an email where like you did not understand the sense of humor that's being employed, and it like led to enragement on your end. But like if it had been communicated in person, there would have been no confusion, right? There's a really funny Key and Peele skit about like two friends texting each other, right? And it escalates to the point where one walks into a bar to like kill his friend with like a nail-filled bat because they've been like on two different levels of their communication, right? And it all has to do with like, oh, well, they didn't have the external senses informing the phantasms as they're doing this kind of electronic communication. And then also it's important in Thomistic psychology, but I won't. Then we'll get into that later if we have more time. Okay, so the second power we're going to go over of the four internal senses is the imagination. And sometimes you might find it referred to as the fantasy. But that's pretty rare. Most of the times, if you read a translation of philosophical text, they'll keep it to the imagination. So the imagination functions as the storehouse of phantasms. All right, so the common sense is what produces the phantasm, and then the imagination is what retains those phantasms. Now, aside from just retaining phantasms, the imagination can also mix and match. Mixes and matches phantasms. All right, so let's say you've seen gold, you know what gold looks like. You've seen mountains, you know what mountains look like, and now picture a mountain that's solid gold, right? What just happened was your imagination took those two phantasms of, the image that you carry for gold and the image you carry for a mountain, and it stuck them together, and it kind of like did a mashup. of things. And this is like that's like a silly example, right? Like obviously, someone talks about Golden Mountains has a good imagination, we say. But even when you're like reading a book, right, you're trying to think out a scene, your imagination is going at work. It's like the author talks about a picture on a table and a hobbit sitting down drinking some tea. Okay, that's another way. Like what your imagination is doing is it's pulling together all these different images and arranging them in a certain order. All right, and that can be done in one of two ways. Either with or without the guidance of the intellect. All right, so this can happen with or without the guidance of the intellect. And when I say intellect, under the guidance of reason, remember the human will comes under the intellectual powers as well. So this can be an act of will, which is where you can get into like committing sin versus not committing sins in regards to the imagination. So can you guys give me an example of when you think your imagination kind of just like runs its own natural course without much direction from the intellect or the will?
Like when you dream.
Dreams, all right? Dreams is the common example of like, you want to know, I guess, what humans would do if there wasn't a reason involved. It's like you would just be thinking in terms of those kinds of dreams, just super random stuff. And then another time is like sometimes people can have their moods affected by like, just chemistry, what have you, going on in different biological stuff. And sometimes that can really like press itself against the imagination and make certain like images come in involuntarily, right? So like if you are angry, right, like there's gonna be things like reactions going on in your body that will like press your imagination to kind of draw that phantasm of the thing you despise, and kind of like your body will want to naturally dwell on that. Okay, but then you're left with the choice of your intellect and will with like, okay, so this anger is present. What am I going to do with it? And when you make that decision, that's when what goes on in the imagination, like say you thought about killing your neighbor's dog, that's when like sin can enter in. Okay, that thought can randomly pop in, right? And you catch yourself daydreaming for whatever reasons. Maybe you should get checked out. I don't know. Maybe I'm revealing too much about. No, just kidding. But when the intellect and will come into play in regards to imagination, that's when you can talk about a moral act being done. The imagination, because it's the storehouse of these phantasms, it is pivotal in understanding new or old concepts via your phantasms. Think of like, here's an example. Say you're not too familiar with the concept of justice and mercy and trying to work through that whole scenario. Sometimes it can seem like there's a conflict, right? Has anyone here seen Les Mis or read Les Mis? Okay. Kind of what's happening is like when you're watching that film or you watch that on Broadway, there's an arrangement of phantasms going on. It's like the telling of a story. But then those stories, like you come to a deeper understanding of justice and mercy, okay, and kind of like human suffering. And so in that way, the role that imagination holds in storing those phantasms and kind of setting up in different scenarios kind of helps to shed light on intellectual concepts. That's what I mean by saying it's pivotal in understanding new or old concepts. All right, now, one of the problems with the imagination is that it is a material power. We're not dealing with the immaterial intellect. Because it's a material power, it can decay, it can decompose, it can be corrupted. All right, so as a material power, it is subject to damage and can impede the intellect if it is damaged. All right, and so typically what you're going to have here is that a damaged imagination is the cause of mental disorders and insanity. All right, they're not able to kind of run through phantasms in an orderly manner. And because of that, they kind of enter into their own reality, right? Where the phantasms don't reflect what's actually going on around them. And then they act irrationally. But it's like the intellect can only act on what it's being fed, right? And so if the storehouse of your phantasms are off, well, then everything that's presented to the intellect to reason about is going to be completely off as well. All right, any questions so far? All right, next is the estimative or cogitative power. So what the cogitative power does is it recognizes the goodness or evil of what is sensed. And I don't mean moral here, okay? By good and evil, I mean useful versus non-useful. Okay, or think of like, we kind of had like a little introduction into the appetites. Think of like how you love what is good, what is desirable. You avoid what is evil, it's undesirable. Okay, so it's like a test isn't morally evil, but you call it a philosophical evil in your perspective because you wish to avoid it, right? It's not something that's causing pleasure, it's causing pain. So while the common sense can pick out, oh, this is pleasurable, this is not pleasurable, this can pick out what's useful versus what's not useful. And when we're speaking of animals which have this power, we call it the estimative power. And it's commonly reduced, one way to easily understand it is, we just call it instinct. All right, so it's by the material cogitative power that a bird can discern, this twig's good for making my nests, go make nests, okay? It has that basic level of assessment, right? Or the beaver says, this is good wood to make for my dam. I use this to make my dam, okay? That is the estimative power. They're doing that by instinct. There's no active reason, but they're hardwired to recognize something as useful versus not useful. All right, so open up your packet to page 83. And I want to read paragraph 398 with you guys. So this is St. Thomas giving a lecture on Aristotle's work, De Anima.
Is this the Philosophy 102 packet?
Yes, yeah, the flippin' packet, page 83.
Mine goes to 60.
You should have received an addition, an augmentation. All right, Nick, if you don't find it, we'll take care of it at the end of class.
All right.
Note, however, that the cogitative faculty differs from natural instinct. Right? When we talk about man, this power isn't called the estimative power, but it's called the cogitative power. So the cogitative power is different than instinct or the estimative power. The former apprehends the individual thing as existing in a common nature, and this is because it is united to intellect in one and the same subject. Hence, it is aware of a man as this man, and this tree as this tree. Whereas instinct is not aware of an individual thing as in a common nature, but only insofar as this individual thing is the term or principle of some action or passion. Thus, for example, a sheep knows this particular lamb, not as this lamb, but simply as something to be suckled. And it knows this grass just insofar as this grass is food. And so it recognizes basic food, but it doesn't recognize, grass, grass, grass. Okay? The instinct draws it towards it in a natural manner. Hence, other individual things which have no relation to its own actions or passions, it does not apprehend at all by natural instinct. For the purpose of natural instinct in animals is to direct them in their actions and passions, so as to seek and avoid things according to the requirements of their nature, right? So it's according to the nature of a sheep that it should not go near a wolf, and so at sight, it has this instinct to flee, right? But it's not fleeing because it sees, oh my gosh, it's a wolf. And those things eat sheep, right? But at a basic level of like just a natural reaction of the visual sense comes in, estimative sense says danger, go, right? And it's only this particular sense of like flee. All right, any questions on instinct? All right, so in man though, this is human nature, not sheep nature, of course, so we got to talk about man. Cogitative belongs to man exclusively. And when you're dealing with the cogitative power, it has some unique things in man. Also, really quickly, when you're dealing with like say an infant or someone who's lost the ability to reason, we can still say the infant has the cogitative power, but it operates the exact same thing as instinct, right? And when you see instinct in action, especially in a baby, it is super weird. So as soon as a baby's born, it knows immediately to like look for its mother and start suckling to be fed for milk. And it's like, who the heck taught you that? It just like came out knowing to like go for that. All right, so that's like instinct in action. So the cogitative power, it reasons about particulars. Under the guidance of the intellect. So if you remember your Plato and your Aristotle, the intellect is this immaterial power, right? And so because it's immaterial, it deals with things that are universal, unchanging, eternal. Well, what about when you need to reason about this particular, golf club being good for your game of golf, what have you, okay? So like your cogitative power kicks in, it has this tight connection with your intellect, but because you're dealing with something individual, you would not kick that up to the immaterial intellect, right? We attribute that type of reasoning to the cogitative power. So because it seems to reason about particulars, it's also called the passive intellect. All All right, and the reason it's called the passive intellect is because it is destroyed at death. Then lastly, about the cogitative power, the most important function it performs is it utilizes the imagination and memory to prepare phantasms for abstraction. So if you remember the process of abstraction, it's how man, he gets his sense data, he forms this phantasm, and then his intellect is able to abstract the form apart from matter, all right, and held that form as a universal, not attached to anything material. And what St. Thomas and Aristotle say is that the cogitative power is what will prepare the phantasms found in your memory or your imagination, and then present them to the intellect. He says, okay, as a way for then the agent intellect to then abstract, and then for the potential intellect to then know that universal. All right, the last of the interior powers is memory. Now, we've already talked about the imagination being the storehouse of phantasms, which kind of sounds like the way people typically think of a memory. All right, we'll just finish out memory super quickly, and then do chapter 5 tomorrow.